Welcome to the Designing Hollywood podcast in association with the John Campea Show. I am your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. The Designing Hollywood podcast show is dedicated to all things movies, the movie industry, and its talented professionals.
Hi, I'm Gilbert Musali, the new president and CEO of Western Costume, welcoming Designing Hollywood back to Western. This is our men's tailor shop where we're custom making clothes all the time, alterations. This is our women's custom made. We can make anything you guys need us to make, alter anything. We can deck out a full army if you want in our military department. Thank you, Designing Hollywood, for coming in to see Western Costume. Hope to see you soon.
A special thank you to our sponsor, Western Costume Company, for their continued support on the show. Western Costume has been a cornerstone of the industry, providing iconic costumes and setting the stage for so many unforgettable characters. Today's guest is a Toronto-based costume designer who has collaborated on plays, feature films, short films, television movies of the week, and series projects, embracing contemporary, period, and fantastical scripts. She is best known for her recent frequent collaborations with director Roberteggers. Her imaginative designs for productions that have received numerous nominations and awards, including Roberteggers' upcoming Nosferatu, is The Witch, The Lighthouse, Adam Egoyan's Exotica. By the way, I'm a big fan of that movie, and you should seek it out if you haven't. Patricia Roseman's Where Night is Falling, Lilies by John Grayson, and another great film, 32 short films about Glenn Gould by Francois Girard. Without further ado, it is our great pleasure to once again welcome back Linda Muir to the Designing Hollywood podcast. Linda, so good to see you again. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we always ask everybody, got to delve into your history and your past again. But you had a great diverse, you've worked, as we just said, on a lot of different kinds of projects. How did you find yourself moving into costume design? I've heard so many different stories. Some people were making costumes for their dolls when they were little kids. Some people went into theater in college and decided that was their calling. What brought you into the world of costume design? How'd you find yourself here?
I sort of found costume design through theater. In university, actually, even in high school and community theater, and then in university, everyone acted, directed on occasion. It seemed to me that when I wasn't acting or directing, then I was the one that was doing costumes, or set, or costume and set. And then eventually I realized that, in fact, it was possible and really very interesting to develop character and to show character, to illustrate character through the use of clothing. And that sort of became my passion.
Growing up and being a part of the Canadian industry, I'm from Seattle. I guess we're Canadian adjacent, and I began my drinking career in Canada as a young man. But I grew up I thought the Canadian film industry when I was growing up was really interesting because in the 70s, there was tax films that were made for tax reasons. You had producers like Pierre David working with David Cronenberg, and then as I got older, there were people again like movies that Adam Egoyan made, whether it was A Sweet Hereafter or Exotica, which you worked on. A lot of really interesting filmmaking coming out of Canada over the last 50 years. How did you find yourself getting into the industry, and how do you think that the Canadian industry at the time, was that a good thing for you? Was it kind of like the Wild West, or was it a small industry? What was it like coming up in the Canadian film industry?
Well, there's a sort of odd thing about the Canadian film industry is that it is divided. The film industry in English-speaking Canada is very different than the film industry in Quebec, which is French-speaking. A lot of really fabulous filmmakers in Quebec, and a lot of fabulous filmmakers, obviously, in English Canada as well. I was working in theater in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. So when I started working in film and television, it would have been in the, I would say, late 80s, through the early 90s, and then really more exclusively in film and television thereafter. So, I was certainly familiar with the films that have been done, before I was working in the industry. There is a lot of shared talent between film and television and theater. A lot of the cutters and seamstresses and dyers that I worked with for years in theater, I continued to hire and work with when I was working in film and television. And the projects that I was drawn to were more alternate, lower budget, primarily because the market was such. If you weren't doing service production, the larger American films that would come to town, if you were doing more Indigenous, Canadian films, they were definitely lower budget. And so I found that my experience in theater was actually really invaluable, because in theater I had to make, everything and anything with next to nothing. So, that certainly was a great experience. I think that my interest, the types of scripts that I was, and the type of work that I was interested in the theater, was definitely alternate. And so I would say that the type of filmmakers that I sought out and that sought me out actually were also, independent, more auteur filmmakers.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff, and the Canadian government has done some supporting of the industry as well, and a lot of, like you said, Indigenous filmmakers. There was a local Heroes Festival I remember going to a couple, like 20 years ago, that was supporting, again, local Canadian filmmakers. So it would be a great place to go to have that kind of. Eventually you'd probably get to know everybody, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think. Canada is obviously, like America, a very large place, and so I certainly can't say that I know very many filmmakers. Guy Madden, I don't know. I totally admire his.
Really? After where I would have thought that you and it would be a natural after.
Yeah, well, he lives, far, quite a ways away from me.
Right.
But I definitely admire his work and have always. Denis Villeneuve, he worked for years in Quebec before making the move to Hollywood. And I remember, in a very early jury for the what is now called the Canadian Screen Awards. At that time, they were called the Genies, being on a jury and saying, no, we really have to look at this film. It's fantastic. It has a talking fish. And it was one of Denis' first films. He's brilliant. So, I would say that, it's impossible to know everyone, and people work on different projects at, different points along the way. And sometimes you're working, with someone else and aren't available, so.
Sure. Well, we're here to talk about Nosferatu, and I just was knocked out by this movie. And I have to say, I judging by Robert Eggers' work, I was completely watching The Witch for the first time. I think I saw it 3 times in the theater, and then, as I told you, I bought the Second Sight 4K restoration where he was able to participate in the color timing of it because he didn't like the way it looked on home video, and he went back and retimed it. It's actually absolutely spectacular. And Robert Eggers, to me, is one of the filmmakers to watch. After I saw The Witch, you couldn't get me to the theater fast enough to see The Lighthouse, and the same was true of The Northman. And tell us about
all very different films,
completely different movies. However, his command of cinematic language, and most impressive is the way he can evoke atmosphere, which I think is a particular skill that very few filmmakers can wield the way that Robert Eggers can wield it. Now, tell us the tale of how did you first meet Robert Eggers and begin work on The Witch? Like, you watch that film and it's so disquieting from the beginning, and from the very beginning, and you're in the woods. There's this just tension that is created, as I was telling you before. Nothing even has to move in the frame, and it's scary. Like, and it drips with that kind of atmosphere, and the costuming, the authenticity. I mean, it's almost, the costuming in his movies is almost another character in a way. And what was it like to first meet him? And what were your first impressions of Robert Eggers, and then what were his impressions of you? How did your working relationship begin?
I think that Robert and I met when he and his producers decided to come to Canada, to Ontario, the province that I live in. Toronto is in Ontario, and because of the availability of the forest. Sorry, my phone keeps going off here. The forest, the sort of virgin-looking forest and wilderness. I think that the idea of shooting in Northern Ontario was brought up, and so he came to Toronto to interview for production design and for costume and for other key positions. And I met with Robert twice. I think it was, for me, very enjoyable. We had, I would say, almost an immediate ease in terms of talking about theater, talking about process, talking about, I would say a little bit, not exhaustive, but just what's important to each of us and what was he looking for. And I think that I think that he is very careful. He's very careful with everything, and I think he's very careful in choosing, his collaborators, because I think he wants to feel that everyone is striving for the same goal.
Yes.
And so then when we started prepping, it was certainly a very novel way of working. In terms of, I mentioned that I have worked with the same cutters, the same seamstresses, the same dyers, the same tailors throughout much of my theatrical career, and certainly in film and television. They're based in Toronto, bootmakers, knitters, and so I felt, because it was a low budget, that it was very important to prep the film in Toronto. So I stayed. I did all of the sketches before, well in advance of starting prep. Robert and Craig and I went to Plymouth Plantation, visited, because they have a very active reenacting or living history entity. And Denise Lempica, I believe that was her name, she was an extraordinary research in terms of the clothing that they were producing at Plymouth Plantation, and just in terms of the blacksmiths that were there, and just really absorbing the living history aspect of that place. And so when it came time to prep, official prep, we prepped the costumes in Toronto. Robert and Craig decamped to Northern Ontario, about 5 hours north of Toronto, and they started scouting and building the locations. And so when it came to, and then Robert would fly to England to continue casting, and so he and I really developed a way of communicating, either at that time it was Skype, communicating electronically, and then really developing, I guess, a language that was a long distance language. And so that, I didn't really arrive on the set of The Witch until just prior to shooting. And yet everything sort of seemed like it had all been, kind of produced at the same time in the same place. The same thing was then true of The Lighthouse. I stayed in Toronto. I prepped the film in my third floor studio, and also going, to see the cutters and tailors in the various places that they were working in. And then I went to Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada, where Craig and Robert and Jaron had been working. And I did several trips, obviously throughout prep as well, but then landed with the costumes, and we started. The difference, I think, between those two films was that with The Witch, Robert wasn't really available or able to come to Toronto. The actors came from the UK, arrived in Toronto. We did the first fittings. They traveled north to do rehearsal, and then I arrived with costumes that were, more or less finished. With The Lighthouse, we did fittings in Toronto. Thankfully, Robert was able to come because that's so important for him. And then the actors, when we were about ready to shoot, they arrived in Halifax, and I arrived with the costumes, did final fittings, and then we shot. So in both of those cases, Robert and I had been kind of unbeknownst to each other, developing this way of working. And so The Northman was really the first film that we prepped in the same place at the same time, all together, and it was fantastic. And then obviously Nosferatu, I think we had 3 false starts before we actually started the prep and carried through to shooting. And again, we were all in the same place together. So, over 4 films, each of us, Craig, Jaron, Louise, we all have learned to work with each other, and we all have learned how Robert works, and we've all learned that he is an amazing conduit. He keeps all of the information flowing. He keeps it all in his head. He does such exhaustive research. Each of us start our jobs, on each of these films so stoked and so prepped and so, brought into his world because he has done his own research.
Sure. Are you going to ask him to shoot a film in a tropical environment next time so you can get someplace where it's warm?
No. I have said what I thought would be, really fabulous, and I think he's like-minded. So we'll see what comes.
Well, I wanted to jump into Nosferatu because, obviously, for horror fans, the original silent Nosferatu, a great example of what was coming out, German expressionism, and then you had Klaus Kinski, the version that was done in the 70s. Yeah. But now, when I first heard that Robert Eggers was doing Nosferatu, I don't know if I did a happy dance. Maybe I yelped in delight out loud. I was so excited because of all the... obviously vampires have been a mainstay in movies for a long period of time. But the Nosferatu character is not the seductor. He's not a handsome dude like Frank Langella playing Dracula in the late 70s. Yeah. or even Peter Cushing and fighting against, playing Van Helsing against Christopher Lee. His Dracula in the Hammer films was amazing, but Nosferatu to me is the purest, I don't know, for me the purest form of a vampire. Like when I think of a vampire character from mythology, Nosferatu is kind of always the thing that I picture in my head. Yes. So, and obviously there is a theatricality to a vampire movie, depending on whether it's going to be a period piece or whether it's going to be even in the modern. The Lost Boys might have been a totally different kind of vampire movie, but they got to be like heavy metal punk rocker vampires, So yes. What's not to love?
Or The Hunger.
Oh, which is one of my very favorites. Catherine Deneuve is my vampire. If she wanted to turn me, I had no problem with that, And The Hunger is incredible. What? Whoever thought to put Bauhaus, Peter Murphy coming out and singing Bela Lugosi's Dead at the beginning? Well, Tony Scott thought of that, so good for that. Good for Tony.
Actually, one that I had not seen until Robert suggested, watching it for research purposes, inspiration, was Vampire, which was completely beautiful and amazing. Yep. And moved me. But a lot of these films I had seen at TIFF, so the Toronto International Film Festival, for years was called the Festival of Festivals.
Yeah.
And so for me, growing up, maturing with such a fantastic film festival in my hometown was really a boon, because I could see, each film as, the year that it came out, and they were all really fabulous.
So with that all said, and knowing how much Robert Eggers does with his research. Where did you begin? Obviously, do you begin with the script, or since you knew what the milieu was and where this was going to take place in the time period, how do you begin your process? Is it research for you? Do you start sketching?
Robert, well, the sketching doesn't happen for quite a while. Robert sends the scripts. He sends then updated versions of the scripts. Quite soon after that, he will send what he has developed as his lookbook, and he has used a less formal version of his lookbook while he's been writing, because he wants to embed in the script, not necessarily vivid descriptions, but certainly accurate, kind of ideas of where a locale, costuming not so much, but certainly character. But in the lookbook, what Craig and I have to start with are a huge selection of images that are paintings, illustrations, depending on the period. I mean, obviously, for the Lighthouse, for instance, the lookbook could include photographs or stills from films, because that was available at the period, that film was set. The Witch was wood carvings, and the Northmen were statues or carvings, things like that. So, it depends on what the film is. With Nosferatu, paintings, and there was also with Nosferatu a very interesting division in the time that needed to be researched, because Orlok is from a totally different period than most of the other characters. The principal characters are Germany, 1838. And then even within Germany 1838, as with all of Robert's films, there are secondary and then tertiary locales as well. So we have Transylvania, we have the Carpathian Mountains, we have the Bukovina Convent, we have the Hunadorian Inn, we have the Roma. All of those sections of the script have to be researched. And as with the Northmen, there were all of those other locales that needed to be researched. So with Orlok, from the very first discussions that I had with Robert, it was clear that his Orlok, his Nosferatu, the film in its entirety, but also his vision for Orlok, was really based in reality, and I know that sounds perhaps strange because
no, but yeah,
it's a vampire film, but I actually do find it far scarier when what I'm looking at is believable, and it is that's not to say that it isn't fabulous and it isn't fascinating to see really stylized and heightened, elevated, design as well. But for Robert, he was always very clear that he wanted a realistic version of 1838 Germany. And so I started to look at not just fashion plates and illustrations from Paris or from London, or I started to try and find actual German fashion plates, which were very difficult to find because I don't speak German and I'm not in Germany. And eventually, when that all did become available, it was like manna from heaven. For Orlok, we looked at paintings, and we looked at military books about military, Austro-Hungarian, it was a range from about 1580 through the early 1600s. And so, Robert knew, kind of what the outline, what the silhouette he was going for, and then we would discuss, when I started to break down actual garments that would make up clothing for a nobleman of that period. I then had to start to say, okay, these paintings, they show the overcoat, they show the tunic in the front, but what does the tunic look like in the back? So you have to start to find each of these garments in its, reality. And then we would start to fit. We did an initial fitting with Bill at Shepperton's studio with David White, who was designing the amazing makeup and prosthetic makeup for Orlok.
It's amazing. That makeup's incredible.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah,
it really is. And I think this is the first time, because I have looked at a lot of vampires in film, and this is the first time that I can think of where Nosferatu, Orlok, Dracula, whatever you want to call that character, is actually so much of a corpse. Like Max Schreck, Krizanc, they were bloodless. They were very white, pale versions, and the little rat-like teeth and the very elongated fingers. But really, Robert's Orlok is so decomposed. It's absolutely fascinating, and so it was. So there were design decisions made along the way in terms of obfuscating, that character for as much screen time as was necessary. The kolpak hat that he wears served to, kind of obscure his rotted head.
Yeah.
Initially, and the huge overcoat, the mente that he wears. Bill lost weight for the role, and he's already a very tall, thin guy. And I gave him boots with 4-inch steel heels that really affected his gait fabulously. And so, he was really kind of, again, not hidden, but he really could go inside of that heavy cloak, that fur-lined, fur-collared cloak, and disappear and come out a little bit more and a little bit more, a little bit more.
It's funny that, that family, that acting, the Skarsgård family, which is sort of dominating all kinds of things, the Last in the Northman, but Bill Skarsgård has quickly become, he kind of is the new Lon Chaney, or the new, of the modern age. And I mean, clearly he has an affinity for this. We just, of course, his Pennywise was indelible, but Orlok, man, I mean, that's like next level. And and he, what's interesting to me, like when you work with an actor like that, talk about, I mean, the relationship that the costume designer has. I've often said on the show that the hair and makeup people and the costume designers are your first line of defense if you're a director or producer to keeping your actors happy. Because they have to know that when they walk out onto that set, they don't want to have to worry about how they look. They have to know they look great on every level. And so, I mean, and it's often said that hair and makeup people can be the psychiatrists of the set because they deal with the actors, and when they wake up in the morning, they come in and hear all about it. But when you're dealing with a guy like Skarsgård and you're doing a creature like Orlok, what's it like for you? Like, is he just a normal dude as he's getting ready? I mean, as you're doing fittings with him, is he happy-go-lucky? Or does he get into character? And what's it like when he does?
Well, it was always such a strange disconnect because Bill has such a beautiful, very young, youthful, boy face. So to see that he transformed into Orlok was always, kind of shocking. But I had worked briefly with Bill on the Northman prior to when we stopped on COVID. Bill had been cast as Thorir.
Yeah.
And so we had done fittings, and I had met him, and so it was maybe that made, the initial contacts with, initial meetings with, about Orlok's costuming a little bit easier, but also, he had met and worked with Robert, and Robert certainly is the most extraordinary, again, conduit, not just between each of the department heads, but also between the actors and, the props that they have to work with or the costumes that they're going to be wearing. And because each of his films is set at a period that is not a contemporary period, the styles are always very different.
Sure.
And they hit the body in very different ways. And so thankfully, Robert seems to cast actors who are totally up for the challenge, in every way, shape, and form. So, that makes it a little bit easier. But, Bill was always really involved in each of the iterations of the costume as it came along. And I would give him time always in the fitting, back off. And we would go, myself and my workroom colleagues, would go off into a corner and we had lots of other things to discuss to give him time to kind of, feel what it was and that he was experiencing. And sometimes that was with the mirror. Sometimes it was just, him running lines, I suppose, in his head, doing,
Sure.
Just to see how things felt. And in between times of actually having fittings with Bill, then the costume was on stands and Robert would come in and we would discuss silhouette, we would discuss shape, we would discuss, weight, heft. And then with Bill, it became very clear early on that overcoat that appears like a cloak, that appears like a cape, it's a very, very heavy piece.
Yeah.
And so we actually designed a harness that fits underneath all of the costuming and comes out through the shoulders and clips on, quick release. We could get it off him very quickly because between all of the makeup, prosthetic makeup that he was wearing,
Yeah.
and heavy pieces, hot pieces of costuming, it was very important to cool him off as quickly as possible. And, so he was absolutely patient and understanding that each of those pieces had to be developed and the costume workshop needed time to be able to, tweak until it became perfect and, everything worked really well. And the appearance was that very heavy cloak was meant to just float on his shoulders and appear magically to stay there, and regardless of what he did. He was lovely to work with.
Well, this cast is stacked with great actors.
Yes.
And, obviously you have Lily Rose Depp, who beautiful, Nicholas Hoult, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Willem Dafoe comes back, once again reteaming with Mr. Eggers. I don't think he'll do another movie without Willem Dafoe because by the way, he's so good in this. Everybody is good in this movie.
Yes.
I still can't get over when I see Nicholas Hoult in a movie Grown Up that I'm like, that's the kid from About a Boy.
Yes.
But he's grown into a fine actor and great ensemble. When you're given a great ensemble like this, and you're like you said, my favorite word is verisimilitude when it comes to movies. I got that from Richard Donner when he was originally making Superman the movie back in '78. He had a sign on his door that said it had Superman, but the word verisimilitude. And since I was a kid, I was like, what does that word mean? I remember seeing that, and the quality of being real in horror, I think especially period horror, is incredibly important. And that was the thing that always struck me when I first saw The Witch, and obviously seeing then subsequently The Lighthouse and The Northman. You really have a handle on creating, and I think your work here is just stunning. I mean, all the characters, the way you, and I guess it makes sense coming from a theatrical background, you really accentuate these characters through your work in costume design. And never more so than your collaborations with Eggers than I think this movie, because you've got people that are a little bit more refined and they're not out in the woods, or they're not attacking villages, and they're not just two guys in a lighthouse. You really got, and you've got extras, and you've just got, it's so lush from a costume design standpoint. What were some of the highlights for you? Lily Rose's work, the stuff you got to do with her, but then, these multi-layered things that the men are wearing. It's really just can you call costumes delicious? I mean, there's a lot of.
I absolutely think you can call them delicious. Well, the cast is truly extraordinary because, you know, in both The Witch and The Lighthouse, because of the way the script worked, the number of costumes, like the costume changes, was pretty minimal.
Yeah.
Because that was what was appropriate for those films. And so over the course of time, the running time of the film, you saw, as an audience member, those costumes inside and out, because, you know, you saw them in all the different needs that the script had. On The Northman and Nosferatu, the canvas got much, much bigger.
Yes.
And so, you know, it was picking and choosing the moments where detail would read and hopefully be remembered in scenes that were much larger. Olga of the Birch Forest, for instance, you know, like all of that hand embroidery, you know, you could read that in the trip through Iceland and on the way to Fulnir's farm. On Nosferatu, again, it was necessary to go through and try to figure out what was the most important for Ellen, for instance. You know, what were the character traits that could be pointed out quietly in costuming? So, you know, it's not clothing that's important to her. It's you know, certainly staying within the societal norms, but no excess. You know, it's Thomas that she loves. It's Thomas that she wants. And that's contrasted really beautifully with Anna. And, you know, Anna is the most precious thing to her husband, and her husband has, you know, lots of money. And so her costuming is golds and metallic threads and light reflecting and precious, everything that's precious. Whereas Ellen is much more practical. The only jewelry piece that she has, aside from her wedding ring and a couple of pairs of earrings, her locket, and she gives that to her husband to take with him, you know, so that she'll be remembered. So those kinds of costume character moments are written in the script. And then when I go through the script, I try to think, okay, how can we illustrate this again, quietly, hopefully, you know, so that all of these things kind of build on top of each other, and collectively they create an atmosphere that an audience is just there. They're there in the time, believing it.
You know, you talked about research. When you're dealing with the horror genre, sometimes it allows you more room to push things more into the fantastical, but and maybe a heightened sense of fashion that might, but in Eggers' films, the costuming feels very, very authentic of the time, of the period. It's as evocative. I mean, as I was talking to you before we started, his creation of atmosphere, even in one frame, that if there's nothing moving in it, you feel that sense of, it's just palpable in the frame. When you're reading a script like this, is historical importance primary to you, or are you bringing to life something that is a little bit more stylized, that you're allowed to add sort of your own flourishes to things, or is it more important to be historical or accurate to the period for you?
I think it's both. I think that it is, for me, really important to read as much as I can read, to find as many sources as I can find, so that I know in my head and heart, you know, what is the baseline. And then I think it's important to then either discard. I don't think we ever discard completely, but I think, for instance, the morning outfit that Ellen wears, actually the morning outfits that all of the cast wear after Anna and the girls' funeral, from there on to the end of the film, that would be, again, it's quiet, but it is an example of knowing what the etiquette that was required at the period. So not shiny fabrics, very plain, mourning crepe, how that was used, what it was made of. Knowing that information, then I could say, right, so mourning crepe, that's really fabulous. It's used in the armbands on men. It's used in later, more frequently later, in veils for widows or for women in mourning. So to try and replicate what mourning crepe looked like and then use it in her bonnet is a bit of a departure, but then it is also, for this film, really advantageous because it shows beautifully, I think, her fragility and her.
Sure.
It also allows Jaron to light, more completely. His bonnets are pretty terrifying, in terms of what they restrict. And also because the funeral happens in the daytime. So I was pretty confident that an audience would be able to see all of the fabrics. They would be able to see the outline. They would be able to see what the characters were wearing. And then when we move into all of the night scenes, that information, I think, is retained. But I did use fabrics that reflected the light and furs that reflected the light more because it's a cinematic representation of mourning clothing.
Sure.
And what would have been realistically accepted at the period.
Yeah, and
I was just going to say that some things are exaggerated, and then other things, interestingly enough, for instance, Orlok's kolpak, the fur hat that he wears. If this was a historical documentary, then that hat would be much larger. And it's an odd shape. It's definitely an odd construction. But, the discussion happened between Robert and myself about, the size of it and in terms of it on bill, in terms of it, an audience looking at it and what is the expectation or the reaction to something like that. So for sure, we modify. I wouldn't say that everything is 100%, historically accurate, but it is an attempt to recreate a period feeling, that will give an audience an atmosphere that they can love and enjoy and kind of revel in.
Well, you guys certainly did that. And, between Emma Corrin and Lily Rose Depp, there's a lot of great female, the female characters have, again, some great clothes. Were you sketching things out? When you read a script like this, do you first take out pencil and paper and start sketching, or do you wait to do historical research? I wait until I feel like I'm ready. And so in the case of the both Ellen and Anna, we thought that we were actually starting in Prague the year before we actually started in Prague. So I went to Prague for a week with my assistant, and then it was just clear that it wasn't good timing. So I had already sketched all of Ellen and all of Anna, and started on Orlok. So then all of that went on hold, and then we came back a year later. The cast had changed because of availability and things like that. And so it was, Lily Rose was just amazing. And, it is trying to refine certain, styles or certain pieces to make them, appropriate for Lily. I think that
before I went to Prague, the fall that we actually started prepping, I took with me all of the sketches for Hutter, all of the sketches for Sievers and von Franz. And I think that because Harding was a little bit later, because of Aaron's schedule,
Right.
I think Harding was a little bit later in our shooting schedule. So definitely Harding I finished while I was in Prague. And then I started to work with a costume illustrator and Sharon Smith, who lives in the UK. And I was introduced to Sharon actually when I was doing The Northman. And because I had done certainly sketches for, all of the characters in The Witch, and that's what we worked to in terms of cutting and manufacturing those costumes. The Lighthouse I didn't sketch because the photographs, it was, the period was, and so, there was certainly ample information that I could work with tailors, in terms of, and knitters, and oilskin makers. With The Northman, because Nicole was joining us late in the schedule, Robert and I felt that and also with Bjork, we felt that it was important to have a really great representation of what the arc of the costumes would be. And so because I was already, I think I did 80 odd sketches for The Northman. And, when I sketch, I do it either in watercolor, and that is not an easy thing to just whip.
Wow.
So
I bet those look great. Are you going to put are they going to be in a book? Is there going to be a book?
What I actually realized is that I needed to develop a system for myself where I could do things very quickly. And so I started to work with one of my assistants in Belfast, David Craig, and he and I worked out a really great way of doing, I would do a fast sketch and then he would refine it. And then I was introduced to Sharon, and, it was, I didn't work with Sharon on, I'm mistaken. I didn't work with Sharon on The Northman. It was David who did the costume illustrations. And then with Sharon, it was like opening up a whole other world for me because I would give her my sketches and a ton of research. And because she is so meticulous, as is Robert, as is Craig, and I try to be, she would say, well, I need more information. And so then I would, very quickly have to come up with exactly what is the ring like? What is the brooch like? What is the hair ornament like? Because she's doing these beautiful costume illustrations. So, the representation of these costumes, film by film by film, changes. What's needed, because in the end, that is, how I use my costume books is to put them down, go through it with, all of the 80 odd, 100 odd people that I'm working with to produce these various pieces. And in Prague, what was really extraordinary, sorry, I have a cold from my grandson and I just...
Oh, no, it's okay. You sound great.
So what we had in Prague was a workroom of extraordinarily talented people. And so, as we went along and needs became clear, I'd say, well, look at the buttons on these paintings of these fabulous counts, the Esterhazy, look at this, dolman, these glass buttons that are painted with gold, and we're never going to find those. So, someone would suggest, well, Zuzika can crochet and she can embroider. And, so we would start to kind of look at what are the options there. And we would work out, bit by bit, a plan for producing, 36 handmade buttons that are weighted, for the three identical versions of Orlok's Mente. And, when you have that kind of talent available, it just is so inspiring. And
sure. What was your biggest challenge on the film, or was there one?
Bizarrely, the biggest challenge was something that when I first knew that we were going to Prague to prep and shoot, I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't speak Czech. How's that going to work? And I work really closely with all of the people who produce everything in these films. And so I was, told that there would be a translator, and I thought, okay, that's interesting. And so on arriving, I learned very quickly that there were certainly a lot of people who did speak English, and then there were a lot of people that spoke no English, and that the types of mostly series television that had been produced, they were more familiar with Victorian-ish, or they're stylized, beautiful pieces, but they're more fantastical. And so when I'm saying please, let's look at this research and the sketches, and authenticity is what we're going for. It took quite a while for that to actually be ingested and understood. And so what I tried to do is ask actors, would you mind coming out into the workroom and just showing, because everyone is working so hard on this, I think it would be really great if they could see how amazing you look in this. And so the actors really picked up on that, and they would go out and walk around, and then I would try to show. When I was back from set, I would show on my phone, this is what it looks like. What we were working on 3 weeks ago, it's gone through, dye, and it's gone through breakdown.
Yeah.
This is what it looks like on set. And, they were amazed. And then Louise Ford, our editor, she always does these incredible compilations midway through. We haven't done enough that she could cut together full scenes, but she does beautiful. They're like a teaser, and they're meant to be uplifting, and they're meant to be get you through to the end, And so
celebrate the work that's been done.
Exactly. And so what she put together midpoint in Prague was so beautiful. And so I asked, could we show this in the costume workshop? So they brought in huge television, and we did 2 screenings for all of the makers and everyone that was working. And I'm not kidding, people were crying to see their work, because it's just so beautiful. And so after that, it really was, clear that everybody was on board. So that was the biggest challenge, bizarrely enough.
No.
And just the long distance of everything.
Sure.
Having everything either bought somewhere else and imported, or bought somewhere else, imported, sent somewhere else to be made, re-imported, it's just a schedule of trying to figure out who can make what and where are they.
I can't believe we've been talking for almost an hour. This has been one of the quickest conversations I've had with somebody. My excitement for this movie and for people to see it, whoever thought about putting it out on Christmas Day was a genius. That's the ultimate counter programming, because, a lot of people go to the movies, they open up their presents. Well, let me just say, without seeming like I'm a corporate shill, I have no problem shilling for this movie because I love Robert Eggers. This is the 4th, in Quentin Tarantino's movies, he says the 4th film by Quentin Tarantino. Well, this is the 4th film by Robert Eggers, and everybody should go because it's an amazing piece of work, and your entire costume department really, And all the actors just are very well served by all the incredible work you did. And Bill Skarsgård, his portrayal of Orlok is going down in history. It's going down in horror history. It's going down in cinema history. Not a surprise coming from the man who could bring such life to Pennywise, but this is a totally different thing.
Interestingly enough, I think both of the It films were shot in Toronto, and Welcome to Derry.
Yeah,
the prequel series is also shot in Toronto. So there you go.
It's a Skarsgård extravaganza.
Yes.
The modern man of 1,000 faces. This is a great film. What do you have in the future coming up? Has Robert Eggers talked to you about what he wants to do next? Like maybe a space epic, something in the tropics, so he can have the sun out. And you can all sit on the beach.
Robert is a fan of the sun, actually. I think that rain, winter. I think all of that is very atmospheric. I can't really talk about the future, but
understandable.
I'm for it.
That's. I mean, the funny thing about watching a Robert Eggers movie, I always feel you have to bring a winter parka with you. Because man, between The Witch, The Lighthouse especially, I'm convinced that when I saw that film, they made the temperature in the theater like 30 degrees colder.
Yes,
man, but don't get me wrong, that's a great part of those movies because the atmosphere just drips off the screen and into the theater. So everybody should go see The Northman. See that because it's already come out. But go see Nosferatu. It opens on Christmas Day here in the States. I love this movie. I loved what your entire team did with this movie. And once again, it's been a great honor to speak with you about this striking achievement in costume design. And man, I can't say enough good things about this film and the work you all did.
Well, you're an excellent interviewer.
Oh well, listen, I just tee it up and I let you guys talk because it's a celebration of your work. I want to thank you for coming back on the show. It was great to speak with you again. And again, Robert Eggers is I think a very special filmmaker. And the 4 movies. I mean, if you want to spend a weekend. Watch the first 3 films. They're very well served on home video, especially the second sight version of The Witch and the extended version of The Northman, or the recently released special edition of The Northman, and then of course The Lighthouse with its interesting aspect ratio. He's a filmmaker that everybody should make themselves aware of, and go see this movie in the theater in the biggest screen you can see it in.
Yes.
Because man, is it cool! Is it just gorgeous to look at? And I'm a big fan. So Linda Muir, thank you so very much for being on the Designing Hollywood show once again.
Thank you.
A special thank you to founder and executive producer Martika Ibarra, co-founder, costume designer, the legendary Marilyn Vance, and of course, John Campea from the John Campea Show. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in to the audio version wherever you listen to podcasts. I am, of course, your host, Robert Meyer Burnett, and you can find me on Instagram at rmburnett, or find me on Twitter at BurnettRM, or on YouTube at PostGeekSingularity. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe, and give us your comments. What would you like to see on the channel? Right down below. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of Designing Hollywood.